We just start recording and we are ready to go. So please.
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Um, where do I want to start? I'm oscillating quite a bit between this chapter that we're reading, previous chapter, and the next chapter on Kant and Goethe. So as I oscillate, I also oscillate between different texts I've read of Steiner. Okay, so I want to quote something from the last paragraph of this chapter. In this chapter, the attempt has been to demonstrate through the example of a few thinkers how the sole impulse of the modern age flows through the evolution of world conception in the 18th century. In this current lives the seeds from which the thought development of the age of Kant and Goethe grew. Okay, so and what I'm most attracted to in this paragraph is the sole impulse of the modern age, which flows through the evolution of world conception in the 18th century. Now, he mentions a few thinkers. Well, I counted 20 thinkers in this chapter, including Bruno, Descartes, Bacon, Goethe, Leibniz. It goes on and on and on. And he also admits this is just a sketch that he's offering us. I also note, not because I want to label and dismiss, that all of these are white European males. Okay, I just think we need to hold that very lightly. So with that paragraph and with this search for the riddle of the ego, which is his obsession in this, I think, this book, I want to quote something from another text of his, the eurythmy as visual, eurythmy as visible speech. And I also want to offer a little demo of what I think Steiner's talking about. My main interest in reading this book, by the way, is to model Steiner. I'm very interested in his interior process and also what we can glean from his external behavior. We don't have any movies or videos of him or his voice, but we do have his lectures and his formal presentations, which I think are very different in style. So I'm really interested in his style and his expression and the different kinds of presentations he offers for different audiences. For example, he's talking to a group of performers, singers, musicians, dancers, actors. He's talking about speech. He's talking about specifically the diphthong. You know, there's the A and the O, and then there's the diphthongs, I, E, U. Okay. And he says the diphthongs have an indefinite, they're very indefinite. Now, I'm going to demonstrate this. The I, E, U. I'm going to slow it down just so you can hear the transition between the different sounds, which is to Steiner very important. So I'm going to ask you to listen with your third ears, okay? And I might maybe even use a little gesture here just to help. One more time. So he's saying the I, E, and the U radiate a Dionysian fire. The A and the O are the quiet power of the Apollonian. So when a vowel sound, he says, I'm quoting him, becomes a diphthong, through losing its sharply defined outline, we have an ascent into the spiritual. The dual nature of words, on the one side, external imitation, on the other side, the depicting of something in its connection with the entire world order. Before man appeared on the earth as a physical being, he already existed as an etheric being. For the etheric man underlies the physical man. The etheric man is the word which contains within it the entire alphabet. So in those diphthongs, you can hear a physical sound, but also a very subtle sound, an overtone, which performers exploit quite a bit. So now I'm oscillating between eurythmy as visible speech, the text I just quoted from, and tried to model. In the chapter that we're reading, chapter 5, and that soul impulse. So my question is, this is my research question, which I share openly, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what your research questions are and what you might be learning from this reading. My question is there a relationship between the diphthong and the riddle of the ego? So with all of that, thank you for your patience. Thank you for the listening of your third ears. Where would each of you like to start? What are you learning? What is your dissonance you might have with Steiner? As the world events we're probably all very aware of are quite conflicted right now, as were the times that Steiner was living in. I think this book came out in 1914, right at the end of the world. Maybe it was written a little earlier, but I think the first edition was 1914. So thank you. I hope that was useful.
Yeah, thanks, John, for bringing in the fullness of Steiner in the hopes of finding some relevance in this particular book. I'll have to think
Sorry,
more
John,
about.
could you tell us which conference from eurythmy as visible language were you reading from?
It was one of those conferences in Dornoch. I don't have the dates because I don't have the text in front of me. I copied it from
Okay.
online, but if you can find it online. I'm going to go out and get a hard copy of it. Oh, you've got it already.
Yeah, I have it here. So
I think it's in the first lecture.
Okay.
And he's talking about diphthongs. It's under speech. But in his system, speech and gesture and voice are all synesthesias. They're all linked. So when he says visible speech, he really means visible speech. That a gesture can invite all kinds of different kinds of participation in the audience. As the interior and the exterior find that in-betweenness. So I guess to understand him, you have to sort of go into the liminal zone, because he has a very different style, I think, and each of his lectures have a similarity, but a difference depending on the audience that he's speaking to, and these formal presentations, such as the Riddle of Philosophy.
John, I have some elements to direct towards answering your question. I don't have the final answer quite yet, but maybe we'll get somewhere. I was actually reading this morning. I'm surprised by your question because I was reading something different this morning that surprisingly dovetails right in with where you're coming from here. So this was from the sixth lecture he gave on the Book of Revelation. He was speaking of his audience. He was giving this to a group of priests, like bridging Christianity and philosophy. And in the particular section, I'm thinking of, he was talking about, I guess the human mouth and throat and what have you are capable of making 32 speech sounds. And he breaks that down into 24 consonants and 7 vowels. Oh, I'm sorry, that doesn't add to 32. Anyways, there's a number missing there. But and particularly he, like that number 7, like that whole section, I'm not going to read the whole lecture, but he's talking a lot about the number 7, how significant that is, and particularly in the book of Revelation, we have the opening of the seven seals. He goes into a lot of detail about all that. But the point I want to draw out here, maybe this helps with your question a little bit. He's like, within all of this, he's talking like on numbers in particularly, and more generally, like to your question on, the riddle of the ego, he's talking about in our current time, we lost what we formerly had, which was this deep sense of the kind of the spiritual meaning of numbers, including the seven there are seven diatonic scale steps in the musical scale, and other things like this, and all the numbers, we had a deep sense of that. But now in this ego development, to come to your question, we've kind of lost that original spiritual consciousness of it, and we're kind of in this new coming back around to Riddles of philosophy, we're coming back into this natural consciousness of natural science, which kind of needs this ego development, which also, of course, has lost this original spiritual consciousness. So anyways, I just mentioned a few little excerpted ideas here, but yeah, there's a kind of a whole world we can really weave together here that I'd like to see the answer to myself as well.
I love that. Thank you, Jeff. I'll check that out. Can you tell me where that source was?
I'll put a link in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Angus?
Yeah, I'm going to focus in on the word that both John and Jeff have mentioned, this sense, because prior to joining you tonight, I decided to jam up on a bit on Shaftesbury. Who was this Shaftesbury? I've got reasons to look at him that go beyond the scope of this conversation. But I heard there was three philosophers talking about him. And one of these philosophers was, I would like to show a picture that they're talking about, and then use that also as a reference point for this sense, what it is we might be trying to do. It's a picture by a Russian painter called Ilya Repin. Is it okay if I share my screen, or do you want to bring it up or something like that? Share screen.
Can you do it, Angus? I think you have.
Yeah, it looks like I can. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Do you see something now?
Yep.
Yeah, great. So this is called The Death of Ivan the Terrible Son, and it depicts how Ivan the Terrible, in a fit of rage, killed his own son. And what is so interesting about this is we can look at it from lots of different perspectives, but one of them is you've got this terrible scene, the murder of somebody, but there's another part of us, there's an inner voice, there's an inner sense that recognizes there's some type of beauty here. There's an inner sense of what I've heard called by William Russell, for example, an awareness of the creator. It's we're somehow in connection with the creator of this being, and Shaftesbury will lead that back to that also leads us back to the mind of God. And so with this inner sense, that this internal voice, we're trying to somehow access a deeper level, something that's universally true. It's something that goes beyond the senses. I'm going to make another comparison. I'll take the picture away. When Steiner, in his I think self-knowledge, I think it's GA 16, he's in one of the meditations there, he says when we feel joy, we don't experience it as something that's external to us. He says we become joy. And also in that idea, I get this, there's this resounding sense of how true it is that I become that essence when I feel happy. I don't say Angus is feeling happy. I become that happiness, or I become that sadness, or whatever that emotion is. And this is somehow an inner sense that we are, I think, trying to develop in ourselves. And my own personal experience is how Steiner leads me forward in this discovery of this inner sense, an inner richness, which perhaps the Greeks had when they saw the world and the thoughts came to them. We lost that with the development of our individual consciousness, but we are trying to recreate that, each and every one of us, at an individual level. And gradually we repiece together the mind of God, something like that. Oh, sorry, there was one other thing I was going to say. I was expecting Ashton to come in on this with Barfield and final participation, because in my understanding of Barfield, that's also what he's talking about. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Ashton.
Could you say just a little bit more about that connection as you see it?
Yeah. Again, to try to use some imagery, we have this perception, if we try to think ourselves into the way that the Greeks experienced this world, as a type of enchantment. So like the individual didn't exist, but felt itself connected with everything, the world process, which enabled them to create the world conception that they had, to experience the world conception that they had. This was like the original participation that Barfield talks about. And then, as Steiner has also talked about in the previous chapters, this sense, this awareness disappears as the ego becomes a stronger force. So we're no longer able to experience the world in the way that they did. And that's the second stage. The name escapes me just now for what Barfield uses, but then he goes on to talk about a final participation. I've got a preferred word for that, which is easy to misunderstand, but I call it a re-enchantment with the world. Some people might understand enchantment as being enslaved, but the etymology of to enchant something is to sing a song and capture. But if I'm singing that song myself, if I've created that song, then I am still doing that as a free being. So it's not an enslaved enchantment, it's a chosen enchantment. I don't know if that helps you connect to Barfield.
Yeah, I think that connection between final participation and this concept of reenchantment is appropriate. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think as an interpreter of Steiner, that what Steiner is sort of unfolding and tracing this development of self-consciousness first sort of, almost like nesting into itself and then trying to develop some kind of picture of the world is sort of like, what we just read are like the rudiments of the beginnings of final participation, which I also think of. I'm like in the midst of writing a little article about Barfield that's more personal or autobiographical, and C.S. Lewis, and so I'm just very aware of what he called his Sophia experience, which he describes as arising out of a time of sort of existential despair that was brought on initially by unrequited love, and which he kind of gradually realized the sort of despair that he felt had more to do ultimately with feelings of meaninglessness and just that kind of unconscious confrontation with the materialism that he had inherited, and that he had this sort of epiphany that the means to know the world once again in a way similar to original participation, but with this achievement of individuated self-consciousness, sort of hinges upon awakening to this aspect of the soul that I think is especially touched on towards the end of this chapter when he's talking about Shaftesbury and Herder, of love and the feeling relationship, or the feeling part of the human being, with love being sort of like the kind of most ontologically basic relationship between beings in the world, and in relation to the divinity, this renewal of participation hinges on a sort of resting in love as the being drawn towards that giving, and like you were saying about joy, that it's like you recognize that the love is indexed to something that's unattainable, and by abiding in the love as desire, and that's sort of like the means through which to achieve a kind of knowing relationship once again to the world, like a living knowledge of the world. And metaphors also facilitates this, because that through the kind of poetic expansion of our perception through the poetic use of language, we begin, and I think this is sort of like the movement of final participation is almost like towards a kind of infinity, but there's like this reconstitution of the primordial interconnectedness of all things that the ancient languages convey in their compact meanings. That's a long reflection on what you just said, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, that Ashton, thanks for for that. It reminds me of what Steiner's discussion. He went on at some length talking about Herder trying to, in a way, defend Spinoza from the claim of atheism and so on, but Spinoza, as it were, tried to take thought as far as it could go in reestablishing this connection between the soul and the world, and it ends up, using the mathematical method, the geometrical method in the ethics, not quite achieving it. It's too abstract. And the importance of love here, which it was like Steiner seems to be saying Herder was bringing more soul content and feeling and love, ultimately breathing that into Spinoza's vision, and also bringing evolution. Spinoza's kind of, more of a static vision of the one substance. But breathing love into the thinking is how you reestablish the soul world connection. Thought alone, it seems what, Steiner building up possibly to Goethe and that whole method of gentle empiricism and love for the object you're trying to know. Love can reconnect us, but thought alone cannot. That seems to be the point of this discussion between Herder and Spinoza, and what Herder sees and adds to Spinoza. So I just thought of that in listening to your emphasis on love, bringing us to final participation.
Can I chime in? Does someone want to speak? Okay. About Barfield and final participation. And I'm wondering if there's a relationship between that and Aristotle's final cause, which, Barfield, I think, maybe other Steinerians think is the problem with our age, is we've left that out because we're so afraid of purpose and teleology. Anyway, I just wanted to share something I read from Barfield just this week. An interview with Shirley Sugarman. I think this is 1975. And he says to her, I'm inclined to think that materialism is going to break up one way or another anyhow, and it's showing signs of doing so now. The crucial question is, what's going to take its place? My answer is that we can't be sure, but it's up to us. He goes on to say, in anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner, it is the evolution of human consciousness being mediated by spiritual beings, beings in the spiritual world. And that, of course, you find elaborated in detail if you go into the literature of anthroposophy. I obviously can't go into any detail, but I do see this definitely as a process of evolution, and there's going to be a violent change of some sort fairly soon, I think. She asks him, you think it's going to be a violent change? He says, violent in the sense of abrupt, extreme change, very quick change. He wrote this in 1975. But I can't help think of the world events that are happening right now. That there's something that maybe goes underground and then it erupts suddenly into what was in the background suddenly becomes foreground and the attention of lots and lots of people, which I think is what's happening right now, probably because of the internet and lots of other forces that are at play. But I'm just open to the possibility that that sensitive souls like Steiner was really very much in touch with anticipating the impasses and the dilemmas and the conflicts, as was Barfield, that we are having now. So I think that, and I feel like, because I feel like I'm sort of connected to them, that my job is not to worry too much about what's happening right now, although I have responsibilities that I want to tend to, but I'm tuning into the interiors of a future people who are going to figure this out. I don't think we are going to figure it out, but we can. I think as Steiner intentionally did. There were some seeds he wanted to plant. So I'm just bringing that forward, and I hope that's useful for us. I'm just thinking that I remember Nijinsky, the great Russian dancer, in 1914, right at the end of the war. He gave a performance in Paris, and everyone thought he was a genius, right? He goes out on stage and he says, I'm going to dance for you the war, which all of you are responsible for, and none of you stop from happening. And then he proceeded to dance. And then at the end of his dance, he left the stage and the audience was silent. They were quite shocked. So I suspect that he was dancing. He was speaking from the physical and the etheric, if we want to use the vocabulary of Steiner. And I think he was certainly dancing from that etheric dimension. Anyway, I'm just sharing that with you guys. Thanks.
Makes me wonder what the etheric or just the soul response or equivalent to both electronic media and the nuclear technologies, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. What is the soul antidote that would meet these physical technologies, which I think Steiner foresaw, but were obviously invented after his death? The struggle of our moment seems to be that those physical technologies are far beyond the evolution of the soul powers which could meet them.
I doubt that seriously. I don't think the soul powers, I don't think the nuclear bomb could possibly compare to what's happening in the subtle realms. So that's my bias.
I think just two things. The first thing you mentioned, John, I think there is a connection between Barfield's, and maybe it's obvious to some people, between Barfield's final participation and the notion of final causes. And that's why I kind of think, for people who may not be that familiar with that, with the notion of final causes, this notion of final participation might seem sort of to suggest that it's something that's been achieved once and for all. But I think when you think according to final causes, that it's like a lure, and that it's sort of like indefinite in the sense of, especially if you kind of see things in the vast cosmological evolution that Steiner presents, that there's so much that could be implied in final participation, so much potential. So that there's that. And then Barfield also, he wrote, I want to get, that's the Sugarman text that you were reading from. I don't have that one, but I haven't been able to find it. But he says very similar things in an essay called The Coming Trauma of Materialism or something like that. And I think, so there's the issue, what I think y'all pointed to as far as technology is concerned, but also I think Barfield's always criticizing what he calls the residues of unresolved positivism in people's thought and the way people think. And I think we're really seeing right now in the cultural sphere, this sort of the trauma that arises when we have been conditioned to think in nominalistic ways about categories that are about realities that have deeper morphological and formal bases than a nominalistic point of view affords. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you a question because I've been struggling, and I was hoping to find it in the text, like a real, and perhaps I missed it, but like a real definition of soul. And so I went ahead and just looked it up, and I think this source looks okay, like it might even be associated with the Anthroposophical organization. But, so the soul has, according to this, it has, there's actually 3 parts to it. The sentient soul, which seems to be a representation that is more representative of our body. A consciousness soul, which is the one that apparently is really connected to spirit. And then an intellectual and temper soul, which kind of acts as an intermediary between those other 2 elements of the soul. And of course, it's an intermediary between, I think, probably material world, our body, and the spirit world. And I guess really what I'm asking is, since a lot of you guys have read a lot, you've read a lot of his different stuff, does that all jive with your understanding of soul being used in this text, or not? How would you argue with that? So thanks.
Well, I would just say in response, and please, if anyone else has a difference, please, I'd love to hear it. But I think there's it's very subtle. There are very subtle levels of our experience. And they're happening to us all the time, but we often don't pay attention to them. And I think we could go back to Ian McGilchrist's text, the left and right hemispheres of the brain. They're moving in and out. They're very, cyclic. We have ultradian rhythms, we have diurnal rhythms, but every 90 minutes, there's a period of activity out there. And then there's a rest period where you yawn and stretch, go to the bathroom, stare out the window. And that rest period is very important so that you can, in the next cycle, be very attentive and open. But if you suppress that rest period, then at the end of the day, people end up, going to cocktail hour and drinking and snorting Coke or whatever, just to keep themselves going because they've overridden that natural rhythm. And I think that's what we've lost. We've lost that rhythm. And I think this is what Jeff was addressing earlier. So I would say there's a hybrid body, which is in between the physical and the causal body. If you want to look at different versions of this, I think it was Abhinavagupta who I can't remember which tradition he was really a part of. He was in the middle of so many, but he often talked about the hybrid body, which he said was neither material nor is it causal. It's in the in-between, and it has certain kinds of powers that the physical body does not have. But I think that is sort of what Steiner's referring to when he's talking about the etheric body. And he also talks about the astral body. I mean, there are levels of consciousness where the awareness can just lift off and is totally liberated from the physical body and can be aware of this. So anyway, I'm just sharing that because I think I have many open questions about the vocabulary that different traditions have used to capture these very, very subtle experiences that we've all had, but are we sponsored in cultivating those experiences? And I think Steiner and I think Barfield were trying to do that. And I think many people are trying to do that now. I think that, and it's sort of erupting in all kinds of interesting ways. So thanks.
Go ahead, Angus, and then Alex.
Yeah. Let's I'm going to try and give us like another description. Thanks for yours, John, to Matt about sort of like what those three different aspects of the soul are, like general anthroposophy, and then I want to actually connect it directly back to the text as well, because I think there's a few interesting things going on there. So very simplistically, from 2800 BC to 700 BC. That was the period when, like, predominantly the sentient soul was being developed. That was just like the main task of the age. The intellectual soul, or the reasoning soul, was sort of like the chief function of from 700 BC to around about 1400 AD, and that's where we see. This is where basically where Steiner picks it up. It's like says what we're seeing here in the Greeks is the birth of rational thinking. The intellect, as we know it, did not exist prior to that. How has that come about? It's come about in the intellectual soul, that aspect of our soul that's been developing. But of course, since the 1500s, like humanity's task, according to Steiner, is to develop a consciousness soul. And what is that? That is an awareness of your essential spiritual nature. I am a spiritual being. I am an eternal being. My ego is eternal. It is godlike. And this is what humanity is going to be battling with for the next it's like 1500, 1600 years, so like coming to terms with what that really means. And in the text, I think it's quite interesting if we can contrast like how Steiner presents Locke and how Steiner presents Lessing. I just read the bit about Locke, and I think I can improvise the stuff about Lessing because I know it better. But when he's talking about Locke, he describes how for Locke, the soul for him is not a being that develops real experiences out of itself, but it is an empty slate onto which the outer world writes its entries, and etc., etc. So this isn't some type of inner sense that's revealing an essential aspect of the world. It's sort of like it's mere fiction, it's imagination. There's nothing real about it. Whereas Lessing, just to mention one of the many examples he does in the text, I mean, he is so his experience of the ego is so intense that he has to create the world conception around this essential truth that he's experiencing inwardly, which leads him, as far as I know, I don't know to what extent he was exposed to Eastern literature, to come up and say, well, reincarnation is the only way of explaining sort of like what's going on in the universe, in the sense of because that's how we progress as human beings. That's how consciousness evolves. it evolves through time, and we have to come back and pick up the threads that we had sort of like last time we were here. And in these two characters, he's like he creates this like these polar opposites. You've got the empty soul of John Locke and the full-blooded soul of Lessing, so like battling with the same question. Alex.
Well, yeah, yeah, very interesting to be following your thoughts and ideas. I was connecting some of them in my mind that I wanted to share. First of all, I wanted to comment a bit about these three aspects of soul in anthroposophy. In anthroposophical circles, these aspects are also spoken about in the development of the individual. Maybe you've heard of the 7-year periods. So sentient soul from 21 to 28, intellectual soul from 28 to 35, and then from 35 to 42, consciousness soul, more or less like that. Yeah, it's just stages of individual development. And personally, being in my late 40s, I can a bit connect to what some aspects that I see, or I still see and saw, and I've seen in myself, a bit connected how these stages are described. And thinking about the text, and also something that John mentioned in the beginning, when you spoke about the rhythmic performer being in between his own performance and the public, or it was something like that, I believe. Something in this chapter that was interesting was, yeah, all these sort of dualistic worldviews between materialism and spiritualism, maybe, or different ways to put it, that I've seen in how I have myself struggled, how to find myself in between these worldviews. Yeah, and I think something that in the end of the chapter, somehow Steiner is referring to, that's the next step that we need to sort of come to terms with and resolve in ourselves. That is being mirrored in the evolution of consciousness that is being described in this text. And I realized that in myself, it's not so clear, or it hasn't been that clear. I was recently reading, I think someone mentioned this book earlier in one of the videos, the Mario Betti and the 12 Worldviews. I think even you, Matt, has written the introduction or a review about that.
I was just typing that in the comments. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So it was revealing to me reading that book how so I studied engineering in my early 20s, and then went on to study arts and graphic design, and then became quite interested in all different kinds of spiritual practices and philosophies. And when I was reading this book, it was quite revealing how I have sort of put materialism a bit away, and in a way how I again saw how well, useful and truthful, not necessarily materialism, but yeah, the ideas of mathematics and physics and all these natural science, how useful they are in describing the world, and they have to be put in perspective with other aspects. And then I want just a final thought. Again, Angus, you were speaking about re-enchantment and how the Greeks maybe were fully participating in that re-enchanted relationship with the world. And something, maybe it's, yeah, just throwing that as well. It seems to me that Steiner uses the concept of ego a lot in the previous chapter, in the beginning of this chapter, but then continues and goes on to using the idea of self-consciousness and a lot the idea of soul. And for me, it feels like there's a broader landscape, a broader inner landscape in the word soul than in the word ego. And this may be more as a question, but it feels that the Greeks were participating fully in such a landscape, but maybe not as aware that it was an inner landscape, as it is now sort of revealing itself as soul becomes an idea or a concept or an experience.
I can add something to that briefly. You mentioned, Alex, there's something broader, a broader inner landscape with soul than with ego. And I think Steiner would definitely agree with you. He said the most spiritual parts of the body are your hands and your feet. So I find that very curious. He didn't talk about the head, the heart, or the gut. He talks about hands and feet. So my question is, and I don't expect anyone to answer this, this is sort of just me improvising. When soul, he talks about that soul impulse in that paragraph I quoted, how the soul impulse of the modern flows through the evolution of world conception in the 18th century. So when soul impulse, whereabouts are your hands and feet? When soul impulse, do your hands and feet have a size or a shape? And when soul impulse, what your hands and feet want to have happen? So I'm just suggesting there's something in betwixt and between the subtle and the material, the perceptual and the conceptual, that all of these writers, all of these thinkers in this chapter are struggling with. So I think that split between the perceptual and conceptual is a very big problem. But I don't think most of us, it bothers us too much. We muddle on through the best way we can, you know? So I think we need to pay attention to those times when we drift off into a reverie or a trance, or we're enjoying a really good book. That those liminal zones start to open up and expand as we give our attention to them. So thank you all for this opportunity to put my hands and feet into this. Thanks.
If I might add something, I think we kind of avoided talking about the monads, which are the problem of the monad runs all through the chapter. And I think what you just said, John, about hands and feet is kind of brings to the front the problem of you know, what how can you put together the genesis of hands and feet and the problem of the monad. The idea that a word means something originally in itself, is the same problem that we have in dealing with a thought that is at the same time self-sustained and interconnected with the other people and the world. So the problem of the division between these monads is really central, and of course the hands and feet show what Steiner thought was the solution to this dilemma.
I'm eager to hear Lorenzo say a little bit more about that solution. I'm wanting to understand better.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a relationship between perception and the borders of our individuality. There is a relationship between, let's say, the skin or the borders of individuality and the relationship with otherness, and in the metaxis that is proven by the fact that we can communicate the problem of how thought and reality can interact, is the key to understand the genesis of such structures as hands or feet. Maybe I'm not really explaining and just bringing, the problematicity of thinking who invented a thing like a hand, which is, of course, a mean. It is something that always stays in between and without a final cause, has absolutely no reason to develop in that way. And I think that so hands and feet are the parts of our body that reflect more our relationship to the external world, of course, because they are arms. And so I think it's interesting to reflect on the problem on the monad and the threshold between individuals, and the genesis of our structure.
Yeah, that's very rich. I was just thinking of, because Alex brought up Steiner's 12 Views of the World and Betty's book on that. If I recall correctly, Steiner connects, obviously he connects the limbs to willing, and in the 12 Views, he connects monadism to the will, to those thinkers who especially emphasized the role that will plays in the world. And I thought that's where you were going by connecting the monad and the hands. But perhaps there's some of that in the background, but definitely more to contemplate here. Go ahead, Angus.
Yeah, just picking up on the theme of monads and coming to the topic of hands as well, like a thought processes that sort of like revealed themselves somewhere inside. When he talks about Leibniz, so he uses this, he reminds us that Leibniz said monads have no windows. These are like these separated off entities. So we've got this picture in there as well, but knowing also the philosophy of freedom well, when he talks about Berkeley, when he talks about Locke, when he talks about Spinoza, I'm bringing all that baggage in there, which, so like the word freedom is screaming itself, so like loud and clear throughout this chapter for me. And one of my understandings, if I'm wrong, I'd like somebody to correct me, but the hands are actually the maximum expression, physical expression of freedom, as I have understood it. And like you were saying, Matt, the feet, specifically the feet, and not all limbs, are connected to the will. So if I hear, it's like people with an anthroposophical bent talking about, it's like hands and feet. In my head, what's happening is this, like this balance between the use of the will and the use of freedom, and how they might work together. Yeah, so I was afraid I was like taking John too literally, but I'm seeing a couple of nods of heads, so perhaps I wasn't too far off piste. Thanks.
Well, I wonder about a dolphin or a porpoise or a whale. They don't have hands and feet, but I would be reluctant to say they don't. There's no final participation for other species. Are we the only ones who have this dilemma, because we have opposable thumbs and we have feet that are quite unique to the human? So anyway, I'm just speculating that there's an interspecies communique happening all the time. If you have a cat or a dog, or you commune with a bird, but when you go to sleep at night, you can become an animal. And of course, dancers and actors are always becoming something else, something other. So I'm just throwing that out into the mix as well. Thanks.
I was just going to throw out a quick sort of almost like a question or whatever about how maybe the hands and the feet might be metaphors. And I wonder if hands might be a metaphor because they represent touch so much. And if you think about it, touch is actually kind of it's a meta sense, in my opinion, because all of our senses rely on touch. Like you need to have noise touch your eardrum. You need to have like light touch your eyes. It's always about touch. And so maybe hands being a perfect metaphor for that might be just alluding to that completely. Now the feet one, I don't know if I have a real good argument for what that's a metaphor for. What I was pondering was the opposite of stagnant. So like the introduction of dynamism. Those might be metaphors for that. You know, it's a metaphor for movement somewhere. So I'll just turn it over to Chad.
I would agree with you, Matt, that there's touch and it's primary. All the other senses arise out of touch. But I would say the feet, take your shoes off and your socks and walk in the grass, okay? I think that's a very different experience than walking around in your Nike shoes all day, pounding concrete. So that's another thing I think we've lost touch with, along with those soul powers and the sense of the subtle, is we don't walk barefoot on grass and rocks. We don't have the sensitivity in the feet that I think other generations may have had. Thank you. I'm just working this out in my own head, but I also misplaced something. Oh yeah, it's hands. He said the most spiritual parts of the body are the hands, the feet, and the back of the forehead. Okay. Now I don't know what the back of the forehead could mean. I know this, but what's the back of my forehead? That's probably why I forgot it.
Did you want to chime in, Chad? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I guess just to back up real quick, dolphins and whales, dolphins do have hands and feet. They have flippers and the tail. And it actually makes sense to me, like the tail is the will, feet, it's propelling the action, and the flippers are freedom, where you're gliding, where you're choosing to go. And just to back up on what Alex was saying about the 7 years of evolution of the individual soul, I believe. I'm not familiar with Steiner's concept there, but that's the Saturn cycle. It squares itself. It performs a 90-degree angle every 7 years. So it's 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, 49. And Saturn is the archetype associated with incarnation. It's how we are incarnating and differentiating and deepening our participation in life at these quadrature alignments, and aging and maturing, maturational process, all that's Saturn. And yeah, so I was just I was picking up on in this chapter anyway, at least in this one section on page, oh, shoot, page number's not here, 114, that where he's describing, let's see, is it, sorry, Spinoza's capacity or in relationship to Lessing, I think. But what I was really picking up on here is like, just, I'm going to read from one chapter. He says, or one paragraph says, time and again, the supporting energy was looked for in the truth or belief or in the depth of the heart, forces that were considered to be stronger than thought, which was felt to be pale and abstract. Like, it's hard for me not to see or recognize what's happening through McGilchrist's framework, in that, you know, it's the left hemisphere that's related to the thought, in the sense of the abstract thought or the mechanistic thought, the materialistic, the scientific thinking, that's being described as creating this barrier ultimately between us and the numinous world, which is a process of the right hemisphere's engagement. It's the right hemisphere that does the access or has access to the whole. And yeah, it's just that this process seems to be one of a movement within our evolution of consciousness, that we have at times gone into a more left hemisphere dominant approach, and it's walling us off. It's cutting us off from the right hemisphere's capacity to know and experience the whole. That's it. There was more to it, but we're over time. So yeah, I'll leave it up to Alex now.
Yeah, just wanted to add an idea. We were speaking about the sense of touch, hands, feet, and I just remembered, I wrote it in the chat. I remembered this idea that for Steiner, the separation, so the embryo, or as a child, we begin by feeling as one, and it's the sense of touch that creates the sense of separation that leads to the formation of the ego. But I also remembered now that in another lecture, Steiner speaks that it's with a, let's say, a healthy development of the lower senses helps the development of what he calls the supersensible faculties of imagination, inspiration, and intuition. I think that's also in this picture of what we need to sort of integrate in order to resolve many of these riddles. That aspect feels also important.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Really rich session. We're really cooking now. I wanted to leave us with just these lines from the end of this chapter. Steiner leaves us with the question that the thinker is confronted with: how must I penetrate into the depths of my soul to be able to reach the connection of the soul with the ground of the world in such a way that my thought will at the same time be the expression of the forces of world creation? I think that's what leads us into chapter 6, the age of Kant and Goethe. Does anyone want to summarize that for us next time? Any volunteers? I'm happy to do it, but
I'll take it. This is Matt. Yeah.
Do it. All right, it's all yours, Matt.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chapter 6. Yeah.
So I will stop